6 months ago I was living in Boston. My wife had left me, which was very painful. And then she came back to me, which was excruciating. On top of that, my practice had grown stagnant and my social life consisted of hanging around a bar night after night. You see, I was clinging to a life that wasn't working anymore, and I had to do something. Anything. So I ended the marriage once and for all, packed up my things, and moved back here to my hometown of Seattle. Go Seahawks. And just like that, the first season, the first episode of Frasier began. As Frasier said during his 1000th show, it's here that you can feel the pulse of the city. And I thought it would be fun to talk about Frasier. It's one of my favorite shows, one of the highest rated shows of all time, and it's generally considered one of the most smartly written TV shows of all time. Even today, it still holds up. Netflix has recently put all 11 seasons on their instant streaming, and recently I had sort of a bad cold, and I was in bed, and I was just looking for something to pass the time, and I found Frasier in my Netflix instant queue, and I remembered always watching it every week when it was on live. And my mother and I would record the episodes on VHS tapes, and we would label them. We'd record every one, and it was a lot of fun to watch. So I thought it would be good to actually go through every episode and do a good in-depth analysis. So I want to start today with The Good Son, which was the pilot. But before we get to that, I have a couple notes on what led us to The Good Son. So of course, Dr. Frasier Crane, as played by Kelsey Grammer, first appeared in the season 3 premiere of Cheers, which aired on September 27th, 1984. It was called Rebound, Part 1. This is the first time we see Frasier, and it's really interesting to see him as just a regular bar patron. He's sitting at the bar before he's even introduced, right next to Cliff. And we know who he is now, but at the time, he might as well have just been another extra. So Diane introduces him as someone who's going to help Sam get clean because he's been drinking heavily after Diane left the bar. So he's introduced as a psychiatrist, and he's actually able to help Sam overcome his alcoholism. And it's revealed in the next episode, I think it was Rebound Part 2, that Frasier and Diane are actually dating, which does not help Sam at all with his recovery. As the show goes on, by the end of that season, into the 4th season premiere of Cheers, Diane has left Frasier at the altar in Italy. And that's something that will leave a sucking chest wound where once there dwelt a heart. So it was during the 8th season of Cheers, like 89, 90, and David Angel, Peter Casey, and David Lee, 3 of the producers for Cheers, who were actually moving on to go create a new show you might have heard of called Wings, made a deal with Kelsey Grammer to do a show together. Now, it wasn't actually supposed to be a Frasier spinoff at the time. It was going to be a show, they thought at first, about like a paraplegic magazine publisher or something like that, who lived alone in his apartment, and he had a Latin American housekeeper who was also his healthcare worker. And that is the only nugget there that actually went on to influence the Frasier that we know. When they thought about continuing the show with the Frasier Crane character, at first they knew they couldn't have him in private practice. The show would be too close to the Bob Newhart show. And then they thought about having it be 100% at the radio show with crazy characters all around him, but that was too close to WKRP in Cincinnati. So they ended up incorporating more of Frasier's home life, brought back the character of his father, who was supposedly dead. We'll get into that in a future episode. And created the character of the brother, Niles, who was a breakout character. Taking the focus away from Frasier's career at KACL was a great idea, putting the focus more on his home life, because it gave the show the perfect balance that my favorite show, The Dick Van Dyke Show, achieved so well. Having Rob's life as a comedy writer in New York, and also devoting usually more than half the time of the show on his home life with his wife and son. Random notes for this episode. Eddie's staring. In the first season or so, Eddie staring at Frasier it's a running gag, and it's done quite well here. There's a great flashback later on where Niles and Frasier are visiting Martin in his old apartment, and we see that Eddie was originally always staring at Niles, but Niles introduces Frasier as the firstborn, and just like that, the staring towards his past. It's a great gag. Daphne's job interview. She is standing at the door, and she's adjusting something in her shirt, and she goes, "Who caught me with me hand in the biscuit tin?" Her accent is much more exaggerated and sort of comical in the early seasons, and it's very, very different than how she speaks in later seasons. Even as early as season 4 or 5, the accent's very different than it is here. And when she says, "Oh, but she's a bit psychic," I realize I can't do the accent, but you get the idea. That was a plot thread that's actually held on through most of the show. I'm curious to find out with you when it actually is last mentioned. But I know it's mentioned as late as season 7, her being psychic. But it's a big plot point early on, and she's always getting psychic flashes. And it's really played for comedy here, and it just speaks to her eccentricity. It's a shame that as the series goes on, she sort of flattens out a little bit. But she's very eccentric in these early episodes, and she pops into the loo to enjoy more of Frasier's African erotic art. That's another great line. Frasier says he will contact her, if not by the phone, I think, then through the toaster. I don't know what the reference is from. I know it's teasing her for being psychic, but if anyone knows what that reference is from, could you leave me a comment? I also think Psychic Toaster would be a really great band name. In this week's episode, Frasier ordered 2 Cafe Latte Supremos, an order we don't see often in the future, and later he orders a double espresso to help him relax. It's funny how Martin is very, very crotchety in the earlier episodes, especially this pilot. He's very different from the Martin in later seasons. And you can really chalk that up to character growth. Also the needs of the series as well. In the early episodes, they really had to emphasize the conflict between Frasier and Martin, or else there wouldn't have been much of a show. But in this episode, Martin basically demands Frasier give up 2 of his bedrooms. And that's a bit much. I mean, he wants to have his own bedroom, which is fine, but now he's demanding a live-in housekeeper as well, which Niles' original idea of having sort of like hourly help was great, but having live-in help just doesn't seem to fit or work. So Martin's saying, "Why can't she just live here?" I thought that was a bit too pushy even for him. We like to say Frasier's pompous and unreasonable, but in this case I think Martin was in the wrong, demanding live-in help. Of course, we know it works out wonderfully. Daphne becomes a part of the family, and I assume you've seen the whole series, but if not, she has a lot of great character growth. But in this episode, if you just look at it in a bubble, it was a bit much for him to ask. One of my favorite lines this episode was, "Gee, what a lovely burden." And there's real drama in this episode between Frasier and Martin. There's real hurt feelings, there's real anger, and there's definitely the feeling that Frasier's being put upon and Martin doesn't feel wanted. Martin's losing his independence, and he's trying to regain some of his pride. Some of his dignity, and there's some real issues being taken care of here. And when Niles says that they should think about putting him in an old age home, we care so you don't have to. It's played later for laughs. It's just like a joking threat, but in this episode, it's a real option. It's dealt with some of the appropriate gravitas for a life event like that, like having to put your parents into a nursing home. It's a horrible decision, and sometimes it is necessary, but in this episode, it's not really played for many laughs. It's actually a real situation that they're dealing with. Lupe Velez, true story. Some people think that her, taking the pills and falling in the toilet was a urban legend, but you should look that up online. It's a pretty good story. When Martin calls the show and he says, "Did you hear what I said? I said thank you." Wonderful, and he gets a good laugh, and you see that now they're going to maybe try to get along and try to live together, and that's what propels the show forward. I think it's a great moment. Earlier in the show, when Frasier says, "Can't you just say thank you?" and Martin just looks at him, and he's too proud to say it, and he says, "Come on, Eddie, let's get something to eat," and Frasier says, "I'm going out." That's real family drama there, and that's not funny at all. But by the end, he says thank you, and he breaks down a little bit, lets go of a little bit of his pride, and acknowledges the sacrifice that his son's made for him. It's a real moment. And it just helps us care about these characters and helps them build in our minds and in our hearts. Maris Watch. This week, Frasier says that Maris is like the sun, only without the warmth. One of the callers on the show today was Claire, played by Linda Hamilton, who's currently playing Pilar on Defiance. And she does a good job with the character. If you watch my Defiance reviews, you know I don't care for Pilar. I think no one should have shot her, but this is a Frasier review, so we won't get into it. And the stinger on the back of Martin thanking Frasier on the air is Daphne, Eddie, Frasier, and Martin. They're all sitting watching a movie together as a new family unit. Maybe a little bit unusual, a little bit unorthodox, but they're a family, and they're going to become a family. So that was The Good Son. Excellent episode. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you thought of the review. My goal would be to review every episode of Frasier because it's one of my favorite shows, and I think it lends itself to a lot of discussion and a lot of analysis. So thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, I'm worried my son doesn't know that I really appreciate what he's done for me.
Why don't you tell him?
You know how it is with fathers and sons. You have trouble saying that stuff.
Well, if it helps, I suspect your son already knows how you feel. Is that all?
Yeah, I guess that's it. Thank you, Dr. Crane.
My pleasure, Martin.
Yeah, what I said? I said thank you.
Yes, I heard.